Listen closely, because history doesn't always change in a year. Sometimes it changes in 5 minutes. It's the middle of the Pacific Ocean, nothing but water, wind, and steel. For Japanese aircraft carriers, the most feared striking force on Earth, are moving like sharks toward a tiny island called Midway. And somewhere beyond the horizon, 3 American carriers wait. Outnumbered, outgunned, still bleeding from Pearl Harbor. The Japanese are certain this is the final trap. The trap that will end America's ability to fight back. But what they don't know is that America is already watching them. Not with spies, not with binoculars. With math, intercepted codes, and a secret message that should never have been broken. And when the first bombs fall, something goes wrong. Something so small, so invisible, that the Japanese commanders don't even realize their fate is already sealed. Because in a few hours, the sky will split open. And 3 carriers will burn almost at the same time. And when it's over, the Pacific War will never be the same again. So the question isn't, who fired first? The question is, how did Japan lose everything in just 5 minutes, without seeing it coming? Welcome back to a story where the ocean becomes a chessboard, and the pieces are aircraft carriers. Today's episode is not just a battle recap. This is a thriller, built from real decisions, real mistakes, and real people who didn't know they were about to walk into the most decisive ambush of the Pacific War. If you love immersive history storytelling, where every moment feels like you're standing on the deck, hearing the engines, smelling the smoke, then you're in the right place. Because this is Midway, a battle fought by pilots who had no second chances, by sailors who watched the horizon and prayed the sky would stay empty, and by intelligence officers in dark rooms who were fighting a war without firing a shot. And by the time we reach the turning point, you'll understand why Midway wasn't just a win. It was a moment that ripped the future out of Japan's hands and handed it to the United States. So grab your headphones, turn the volume up, and stay with me until the end. Because the most terrifying part of this story isn't the explosions. It's the fact that Japan had the advantage, the numbers, the experience, and still lost everything because of one hidden weakness. And once you see it, you'll never look at modern warfare the same way again. 6 months before Midway, the world seemed to freeze. December 7, 1941. Pearl Harbor. The United States, still feeling distant from the war, was suddenly dragged into it, in the most brutal, humiliating way imaginable. In Hawaii, battleships burned. The sky filled with enemy aircraft. The harbor became a graveyard of steel. And when the smoke finally began to settle, one truth became impossible to ignore. This war would not be decided by how many soldiers you could land on a beach. Modern war would be decided by who could strike first, from far away, faster than the enemy could even think. Japan understood that before anyone else did. They had built something the world had never truly faced, carrier warfare. Not one aircraft carrier, not 2, but a moving punch, an air force that could travel thousands of miles, attack, and vanish back into the ocean before anyone could respond. And in early 1942, Japan kept winning. The Philippines fell. Singapore fell. The Dutch East Indies fell. The map of the Pacific changed like paper burning from the edges, fast, unstoppable. In Tokyo, war planners began thinking, we've cracked America. Now we just need to make sure they never stand up again. And the key to that was America's aircraft carriers. Because after Pearl Harbor, battleships were no longer the future. Carriers were. And Japan wanted to cut that future out of American hands. They had every reason to feel confident. Their pilots were experienced. Their fleet was powerful. Their morale was high. And they had already proven they could hit America in its own backyard. Then came an idea that sounded perfect. The trap. If Japan could lure the American carriers out into a battlefield chosen by Japan, then they could destroy them in one decisive clash. And after that, America would have no way to challenge Japan in the Pacific. Not quickly. Maybe not at all. That's where the name Midway enters the story. Midway wasn't a city. Midway wasn't a nation. Midway was a tiny ring of land in the middle of the ocean. But its location mattered. It sat on the route between Hawaii and the wider Pacific. A link in the chain. To Japan, Midway was bait. If they attacked Midway, America would have to respond. And once America responded, Japan's main fleet would be waiting, ready to wipe them out. It was a plan that felt logical. Too logical. Because war plans that look perfect on paper usually hide something. And what Midway hid wasn't in the ocean. It was somewhere quieter. Somewhere that didn't even look like a battlefield. A dark room where people stared at numbers and symbols for hours, in silence, without applause, without knowing what they were about to change. They were codebreakers. And while Japan was building a trap at Midway, America was building the most deadly weapon of modern war. Information. And once America knew where and when, a fleet that was outnumbered could become the hunter. While Japan was preparing a trap in the open ocean, America was fighting a different kind of war. A war without gunfire. A war fought with paper, radio signals, and exhausted minds. In a place called Station HYPO, Pearl Harbor's intelligence unit, cryptanalysts stared at Japanese naval codes until the symbols began to feel like a language of ghosts. Because Japan didn't send plans in plain words. They sent them in fragments. Numbers. Call signs. Coordinates. And if you could piece those fragments together, you didn't just know what the enemy wanted to do. You knew what the enemy would do. The man leading this effort was Commander Joseph Rockefeller. Not a glamorous battlefield hero. No medals. No cinematic speeches. Just a brilliant, stubborn mind, and a team that refused to accept, "We don't know," as an answer. In late May 1942, the Japanese were using a mysterious target code name. AF. Messages kept referencing AF, its defenses, its water supply, the timing of the attack. Rockefeller believed AF was Midway. But in war, belief isn't enough. He needed proof. So the Americans did something deceptively simple and unbelievably risky. They sent a message from Midway, unencrypted, saying the island was running low on fresh water. They knew the Japanese were listening. And sure enough, Japanese intelligence intercepted it. Then Japan sent its own coded message. AF is short on water. That was it. The final confirmation. The moment the puzzle snapped into place. Rockefeller now had something almost no one gets in war. Certainty. America knew the target. America knew the approximate timetable. America knew this wasn't just another raid. It was an attempt to lure U.S. carriers into a killing field. So Admiral Chester Nimitz made a decision that could have ended his career or saved the war. He took his battered carrier force, and instead of defending like a wounded animal, he positioned it like a hidden blade. 3 carriers, Enterprise, Hornet, and Yorktown, barely repaired after the Battle of the Coral Sea. Yorktown should not have been ready. Workers hammered, welded, and patched her deck like surgeons trying to keep a patient alive long enough to fight. And somehow, she sailed. Then Nimitz placed the carriers northeast of Midway, out of sight, out of the expected path. So when Japan arrived, expecting an empty ocean, America would already be there, waiting. And here's the terrifying part. If Rockefeller was wrong, if the Japanese chose a different approach, if the carriers were found too early, America could lose everything in one day. But Nimitz gambled anyway. Because once you have the enemy's plan, you don't just prepare to survive. You prepare to ambush. And as Japan's fleet moved toward Midway, confident, disciplined, certain that America would react exactly as predicted, the trap began to close. It wasn't Japan's trap anymore. The morning of June 4th, 1942 begins quietly. Too quietly. The Pacific Ocean is calm, almost innocent. The sky is clear. The wind is light. On the decks of 4 Japanese aircraft carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, engines begin to roar. This is the opening move. At dawn, wave after wave of Japanese aircraft lift into the air and turn toward Midway Island. Fighters, dive bombers, torpedo planes. A perfectly timed strike. From the Japanese perspective, everything is unfolding exactly as planned. They believe the American carriers are far away. They believe Midway will be neutralized in a single blow. They believe this is the first step toward final victory in the Pacific. On Midway, radar screens light up. The warning comes early, but not early enough to stop the attack. Sirens scream. Anti-aircraft guns rise. American pilots sprint toward their planes as explosions begin tearing into the island's defenses. Bombs fall across airfields. Fuel depots erupt into smoke. Runways are scarred and broken. Yet Midway does not collapse. It bleeds, but it fights back. American fighters rise into the sky and meet the attackers head-on. Anti-aircraft fire punches holes through formations. Bombers are damaged, scattered, forced to pull away. When the Japanese strike force turns back toward its carriers, they carry a dangerous message. Midway is damaged, but not destroyed. And that single fact changes everything. Because now the Japanese commanders face a decision. A decision made not in panic, but in confidence. Admiral Chuchi Nagumo, commander of the carrier force, must choose. Does he launch a second strike on Midway to finish the job? Or does he prepare his aircraft to attack the American carriers, which he believes must be somewhere nearby? Nagumo chooses to rearm. And on paper, it makes sense. The Japanese doctrine values precision and overwhelming force. They do not want to risk their carriers against unknown threats. So he orders the aircraft, already armed for anti-ship attacks, to be reconfigured for another land strike. Bombs are removed. Torpedoes are swapped. Fuel hoses are dragged across the decks. Planes are moved. Bomb carts roll. The carrier decks become crowded, chaotic, dangerous. What Nagumo doesn't know is that American aircraft are already in the air. Not in perfect formation. Not with flawless coordination. But coming. And while the Japanese focus on Midway, they are slowly exposing themselves. Because carrier warfare has one brutal rule. The most dangerous moment is not when planes are launching, but when they are being rearmed. And somewhere beyond the clouds, that moment is approaching. Out on the American carriers, the mood is not confidence. It's tension, mixed with uncertainty. They know Japan is out there. They know Midway is under attack. But the ocean is vast, so vast that entire fleets can vanish inside it. And carrier warfare doesn't give you the luxury of waiting. If you wait too long, the enemy finds you first. So the Americans launch. Enterprise. Hornet. Yorktown. Flight decks roar as aircraft race forward and leap into the sky. Dive bombers climb. Fighters form up. Torpedo planes skim low over the water. But here's the problem. The American strike is messy. The coordination breaks down almost immediately. Some squadrons take the wrong heading. Some lose contact with others. Some run low on fuel earlier than expected. And in the middle of that confusion, one painful truth becomes clear. They don't know exactly where the Japanese carriers are. They have an estimated location. They have assumptions. But assumptions get people killed. So American pilots fly into open ocean, searching. Minutes stretch. Then an hour. Fuel drains. The cockpit becomes a sweatbox. And the horizon stays empty. Until, finally, shapes appear. Not land. Not clouds. Ships. The Japanese fleet. It's a sight that snaps everything into focus. Carriers in the center. Cruisers and destroyers forming defensive rings. And above them, Zero fighters patrolling like guard dogs. The American pilots understand instantly. This is the moment. This is the war. And the first Americans to arrive are the torpedo squadrons. They come in low. So low the waves spray up and strike their wings. They have to be low for the torpedoes to work. But being low means being exposed. It means you're flying into the teeth of the enemy. And the Japanese respond with brutal efficiency. Zeros dive. Anti-aircraft guns erupt. Black flak bursts punch the sky. The torpedo planes keep coming anyway. One after another. They charge straight toward the carriers. But the carriers don't sit still. They turn hard, zigzagging, throwing off the torpedo runs. And the Zeros tear into the torpedo squadrons like they've been waiting for this moment all their lives. Planes fall into the sea. Smoke trails spiral downward. The formation collapses. And from a distance, it looks like a massacre. A complete failure. The kind of attack that gets remembered as desperation, not strategy. But here's what the Japanese don't realize yet, and what the Americans in those cockpits cannot possibly know. Those torpedo squadrons, even as they're being destroyed, are doing something incredibly important. They are pulling the Japanese fighters down. They are dragging the enemy's defensive shield away from the sky above. They are forcing the carriers to maneuver wildly. They are creating chaos at sea level. And while the Japanese focus on the low attack, something else is happening above the clouds. Something that will decide the entire battle. Because the most deadly weapons in carrier warfare aren't the torpedo planes that everyone sees. It's the dive bombers you don't. And they are almost in position. Up in the high-altitude air. The American dive bombers are running out of time. They've been flying for what feels like forever, burning fuel, scanning the horizon, listening to nothing but engine noise and the occasional crackle of radio. And the worst part is, they're lost. Not completely lost, but drifting. The kind of drifting that kills entire squadrons. Because a carrier strike isn't like a normal mission. There's no runway waiting for you on the other side. There's no safe base to land. Your carrier is a moving dot on the ocean. If you can't find it again, you disappear. Some pilots begin to wonder if the Japanese carriers were never there. Maybe the reports were wrong. Maybe the fleet moved. Maybe Midway was the real target, and the carriers are already too late. And that doubt, just for a few minutes, is deadly. Because in war, the moment you begin to second-guess is the moment your enemy gets ahead of you. Then one American pilot sees something. A thin line on the water. A wake. Not the wake of a carrier, too small. A destroyer. A single Japanese destroyer racing across the sea. It's heading somewhere with purpose. The pilot, Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey, leading the Enterprise Air Group, stares down at that tiny ship and feels his instincts scream. Destroyers don't race alone for no reason. They escort something. Or they're chasing something. Or they're returning to something. And McCluskey makes a decision that will either save the entire American fleet, or ruin it. He follows the destroyer. He turns his entire formation toward that one wake line, gambling that the destroyer is leading him to the carriers. This is not a calculated move. This is intuition. This is nerve. This is the kind of choice history remembers only if it works. Because if McCluskey is wrong, his planes will burn fuel, run out of range, and the Japanese carriers will survive to find the American carriers first. And if that happens, Midway becomes a slaughter. But McCluskey commits. The dive bombers swing around like a flock changing direction mid-flight. The ocean below becomes a moving mirror. Clouds drift above. And the seconds stretch so long that pilots start checking gauges again, and again, and again. Fuel dropping. Hope dropping. Then suddenly, the horizon changes. It's not empty anymore. Shapes appear. First a few. Then many. And in the center, flat decks. Aircraft carriers. Japanese carriers. Akagi. Kaga. Soryu. The giants. The same giants that launched the Pearl Harbor attack. The same giants that have been turning the Pacific into Japanese territory for half a year. McCluskey doesn't celebrate. He doesn't scream. He just does what he was trained to do. He signals the attack. And now everything becomes fast. Because the Japanese are in the worst possible position. Below, their decks are crowded. Planes are being rearmed. Fuel hoses are laid out. Bomb carts are moving. Their fighter cover is low, chasing torpedo planes at sea level. And the Japanese carriers are turning hard, zigzagging, trying to avoid torpedoes. So the decks are not clean. Not organized. Not ready. They are vulnerable. And the American dive bombers are directly above them. For the pilots, it's like seeing a door left open. A door that will only stay open for seconds. And as they begin their descent, you can almost feel the sky tighten. Because now comes the moment where physics becomes fate. Dive bombing is not gentle warfare. You point your nose down toward the ocean. The carrier grows in your windshield. The wind screams. The aircraft shakes. Your vision tunnels. And you have to hold that dive even as anti-aircraft fire starts bursting around you. Black puffs. Flashes. Metal fragments. You can't dodge too early, or you miss. You can't pull up too late, or you die. And as the American dive bombers drop, one by one, they enter what pilots call the vertical world. The carrier is no longer a ship. It's a target, a rectangle of steel. And the bomb in your belly becomes the only thing that matters. Down below, the Japanese finally realize what's happening. At first it's confusion. A few crew look up. Then more. Then officers. Then panic spreads like electricity. Because you can't hide an aircraft carrier. You can't run fast enough. You can only try to shoot. And the Japanese anti-aircraft guns open up. The sky becomes crowded with flak. But the dive bombers are already committed. And this is where Midway becomes more than a battle. It becomes a moment of human pressure. Because inside those cockpits, men are experiencing something ancient and modern at the same time. Ancient fear. Modern technology. A primal instinct to pull away. And a trained discipline to keep diving anyway. And now, in the middle of that dive, with the carrier filling the windshield, a pilot has a split-second thought. If I let go too early, I waste everything. If I let go too late, I don't come home. And then, the bombs are released. For a fraction of a second, there is silence. Not because the world is silent, but because the mind becomes too focused to hear anything else. Bombs drop. They fall like a verdict. And the Japanese carriers, packed with fuel, bombs, and aircraft, are about to discover the cruelest truth in carrier warfare. A ship isn't most vulnerable when it's being attacked. It's most vulnerable when it's preparing to attack. And right now, the Japanese are preparing, which means the next few minutes won't just decide the battle. They'll decide the entire future of the Pacific. The bombs fall, and the world changes in seconds. From above, the pilots can't see the full consequence yet, only flashes, smoke, and the violent bloom of fire across steel decks. But down on the carriers, it's the moment the entire Japanese plan begins to collapse. Because a carrier deck is not just a runway. It's a loaded weapon. It's aviation fuel. It's bombs stacked in rows. It's torpedoes on carts. It's aircraft packed wing to wing. And when a bomb lands in the wrong place, it doesn't just explode. It triggers everything. The first major hit tears into Kaga. Flames leap across the deck as if the ship itself has been soaked in gasoline. A second hit follows. Then another. You don't even need to imagine the sound to feel it. Metal cracking, fuel igniting, air rushing into fire. The deck becomes a furnace. Aircraft that were moments away from launching become burning wrecks, wings twisted, frames collapsing, smoke pouring upward in thick curtains. Across the formation, Akagi is struck. And Akagi is the flagship, Nagumo's pride, the symbol of the entire carrier force. A bomb punches into the heart of the carrier's hangar spaces, where aircraft are stored like ammunition inside a magazine. The result is immediate panic. Fire crews rush in. Hoses uncoil. Men shout orders that can't be heard over the roar. But there's a problem. Fire on a carrier isn't like fire anywhere else. It doesn't behave. It spreads through fuel lines. It crawls under aircraft. It ignites bombs. It feeds itself. And the more you fight it, the more it seems to grow. Then Soryu takes hits too. From the air, it looks almost unreal. 3 carriers in a span of minutes, each transforming from a sleek weapon into a burning monument. And the Japanese don't just lose ships. They lose tempo. They lose initiative. They lose the ability to think in clean decisions. Because in warfare, shock is as lethal as bullets. Even the most disciplined force in the world can be broken, not by fear alone, but by speed. By the way a disaster unfolds too fast for the mind to process. On the bridges and in the command spaces, officers scramble to understand what's happening. Some assume it's just damage, something they can contain. They don't realize yet that these ships are dying. They don't realize that the entire carrier strike force is being erased in real time. Nagumo's staff tries to reorganize. They try to coordinate counterstrikes. They try to find out where the American carriers are. But the radios are filled with confusion. Smoke blocks visibility. Deck operations are impossible. And even if you wanted to launch planes, you can't launch planes from a deck that is literally on fire. Now picture the psychological moment. Just minutes ago, Japan believed it was the hunter. Now the hunter is bleeding. And the ocean doesn't care. The ocean does not slow down for strategy meetings. It does not pause for shock. It just keeps moving. Waves hitting steel. Wind feeding smoke. And somewhere out there, the American carriers are still hidden. Still alive. Still launching. Still striking. For the American pilots overhead, the scene below becomes a nightmare of smoke and heat. Some planes pull up, engines screaming, diving past flak bursts. They're running the gauntlet now, because the Japanese guns are still firing. But firing becomes more desperate than controlled. The Japanese are shooting at everything. The sky is filled with black bursts, streaks of tracer fire, flashes of panic. And yet, the carriers continue burning. Worse than burning, they begin to lose their internal structure. Fire slips into the hangar decks. It finds stored fuel. It finds loaded bombs. And suddenly you get secondary explosions, harder, heavier, deeper. Like the ship is being punched from the inside. On one carrier, the deck buckles. On another, aircraft explode where they sit. On another, smoke grows so thick that men can't even see each other. And the Japanese begin doing the only thing left. They try to save their commanders. They try to save their ships from sinking. They try to control the uncontrollable. But now, here comes the cruel irony. The exact reason the Japanese were vulnerable, the rearming process, was also the reason they can't recover. Because during rearming, bombs and torpedoes are moved out of secure storage. They're exposed. They're stacked. They're everywhere. So when the bombs hit, it's not just damage. It's ignition. In just a few minutes, Japan's 4-carrier strike force has turned into 3 burning carriers. And one last surviving carrier somewhere nearby. Hiryu. And here's the terrifying part. Hiryu hasn't been hit yet. Hiryu still has planes. Hiryu still has pilots. Hiryu still has the power to hurt America badly. And Hiryu's commander understands something immediately. This battle is not over. This battle is now a race. A race to strike back before the Americans strike again. So while 3 Japanese carriers burn, Hiryu launches its counterattack. And the moment Hiryu's planes lift into the air, the war flips into a second act. Because now we're no longer watching a trap collapse. We're watching a wounded force lash out. And if Hiryu can find and cripple the American carriers, the victory could still be stolen back. The Japanese pilots climbing into their aircraft don't look at the burning carriers beside them as symbols of defeat. They look at them as motivation. They take off through smoke. They rise into the sky. And they head toward the American fleet. To do the one thing that could still save Japan's day. Destroy an American carrier. And somewhere over the ocean, an American ship is about to become the new target. While 3 Japanese carriers burn behind them, the aircraft of Hiryu climb into the sky. They take off through smoke. Through falling ash. Through the knowledge that this mission is no longer about victory in the traditional sense. It's about survival. Hiryu's commander understands the situation with brutal clarity. If Hiryu can strike back, fast and hard, this battle can still be pulled out of disaster. Not by winning cleanly, but by crippling the American carriers before they can strike again. The Japanese pilots know what's at stake. They know their fuel is limited. They know their return deck may not exist when they come back. But they take off anyway, because carrier warfare leaves no room for hesitation. Somewhere across the ocean, the American carriers are still moving, still hidden, still uncertain how badly they've hurt the enemy. On Yorktown, the mood is cautious optimism. Pilots are landing. Deck crews rush to refuel, rearm, relaunch. Damage reports are coming in from Midway and the air groups. But there's no celebration. Because the Americans know something vital. As long as one Japanese carrier remains untouched, the battle is not over. Then radar picks up contacts. Closing. The warning ripples through the fleet. Japanese aircraft are coming in. Yorktown's crew snaps into motion. Fighters scramble to intercept. Anti-aircraft guns rotate skyward. Damage control teams brace for impact. From above, the Japanese pilots spot the American carrier. It's not hard to see. A flat deck cutting through the water. White wakes trailing behind escort ships. The unmistakable signature of a carrier group. They begin their attack. Dive bombers peel off first. They plunge toward Yorktown with terrifying precision. The ship turns hard, zigzagging through the waves, trying to throw off the aim. Anti-aircraft fire erupts, shells bursting in black clouds around the attackers. One bomb hits. Then another. Explosions rip across the deck. Smoke pours upward. The deck shakes. For a moment, it looks like Yorktown is finished. But here's the thing about Yorktown. She refuses to die easily. Damage control teams race into the smoke. Fire hoses come alive. Crews seal compartments. Engine rooms fight to keep power flowing. Within hours, sometimes within minutes, Yorktown appears to recover. So much so that Japanese pilots, watching from above, report something shocking. They believe they've attacked two different American carriers. They don't realize it's the same ship, patched, repaired, and fighting back. That mistake matters, because it convinces Hiryu's commander that at least one American carrier still remains unscathed. So he orders a second strike. Torpedo planes this time. They skim the ocean surface, racing toward Yorktown. The carrier turns again. Guns fire again. But torpedoes don't need perfect aim. They just need proximity. One detonates near the hull. A massive column of water erupts. The shockwave tears through the ship. Yorktown shudders. Power fails. The carrier slows. This time, the damage is severe. Yorktown begins to list. Her fate seems sealed. And now, finally, it looks like Japan has evened the score. For a brief window, both sides have lost carriers. Both sides are bleeding. Both sides are unsure who still holds the advantage. But here's where Midway becomes something else. Because unlike Japan, America still has Enterprise and Hornet untouched. And more importantly, America knows where Hiryu is. Yorktown's sacrifice has bought time. Time for reconnaissance. Time for aircraft to be rearmed. Time for one last strike. American dive bombers rise again. They don't fly blindly this time. They have bearings. They have sightings. They have confidence. And when they reach Hiryu, the pattern repeats. Dive bombers break formation. They plunge. Anti-aircraft fire explodes around them. But Hiryu's deck, like the others before it, is not ready. Bombs hit. Fire spreads. Smoke climbs. Hiryu burns. By late afternoon, the last operational Japanese carrier is mortally wounded. The battle, finally, is decided. But the ocean doesn't celebrate. It absorbs the wreckage in silence. As night falls, the sea is lit by burning ships, drifting debris, and the glow of fires fading into darkness. Japan retreats. America holds. And for the first time since Pearl Harbor, the direction of the Pacific War has changed. Not because Japan stopped fighting, but because Japan can no longer attack with confidence. Midway doesn't end the war, but it ends Japan's expansion. It ends the illusion of invincibility. It ends the belief that carrier power can be risked without consequence. And as the ships pull away, as survivors are rescued, as the smoke thins, one truth becomes impossible to deny. World War II did not turn because of overwhelming force. It turned because of timing, because of information, because of decisions made under impossible pressure, and because for 5 minutes, the sky belonged to the right people, at the right moment, above the right ships. Here's where most Midway stories get simplified. They say it was luck. They say American dive bombers just happened to arrive at the perfect moment, and Japan just happened to be rearming, and 3 carriers just happened to explode. A miracle. A 1-in-a-million moment. And it's true, Midway contains incredible timing. But calling it luck is like calling a chess checkmate good fortune. Because if you look closely, Midway wasn't a miracle. It was the collision of 2 very different philosophies of war. Japan believed in perfection. America believed in adaptation. And that difference mattered more than the number of ships. Let's start with the Japanese plan. Japan didn't come to Midway casually. This was not a raid. This was a carefully constructed operation designed to force America into one decisive battle, just like the great naval clashes of the past. The Japanese wanted America to fight on Japan's terms. They wanted to lure U.S. carriers out by attacking Midway, then destroy those carriers, then seize Midway as a stepping stone toward Hawaii, and then, only then, use that position to pressure America into negotiation. It was a strategy built on a certain assumption, that America would react slowly, that America wouldn't know the plan until it was already happening, that the Japanese could control the tempo. But there was a flaw buried inside the plan. A flaw most people don't notice, because it doesn't look dramatic. It looks like paperwork. Complexity. Japan's Midway operation was huge and spread out. There was a main carrier strike force, a battleship force behind it, an invasion force, a diversionary attack on the Aleutians, submarines deployed in picket lines. It was a giant web, and giant webs have a problem. They require perfect timing, perfect communication, perfect synchronization. But war is not perfect. War is interference. War is missed radio calls, fog, delays, and human error. That sprawling complexity meant that when something went wrong, the entire plan couldn't bend. It could only break. Now compare that to the American approach. America didn't have the luxury of perfection. America was bleeding. America had fewer carriers. America had less experience. So America did something that looks almost reckless. They took incomplete information and turned it into an ambush. This is the first twist of Midway. The battle was not decided by the dive bombers alone. It was decided by intelligence, by the fact that America knew the target was Midway, by the fact that America knew the timetable, by the fact that America knew where the carriers would be. That allowed Nimitz to do something brutal. He didn't protect Midway first. He protected the carriers. He treated Midway like bait of his own. Because if Midway held long enough, the carriers could strike the Japanese carriers. And if the Japanese carriers fell, Midway would survive by default. Now, another twist, one that feels counterintuitive. The American torpedo squadrons weren't just tragic heroes. They were part of the turning mechanism. They were the reason the Japanese fighters were low. They were the reason the Japanese carriers were maneuvering wildly. They were the reason the defensive shield was distracted. So when the dive bombers arrived, it wasn't random. It was built. It was the result of pressure stacking on pressure. And now we have to talk about the decision that, in many ways, killed the Japanese carriers before the bombs even hit. Nagumo's rearming dilemma. This is one of the most important and misunderstood moments in carrier warfare. People imagine rearming like changing a magazine in a rifle. Quick, simple. It wasn't. On Japanese carriers, rearming involved moving bombs and torpedoes out of storage, across hangar decks, onto elevators, onto the flight deck, and then attaching them to aircraft. It involved fuel lines. It involved aircraft being repositioned because carrier decks are tight spaces. And most importantly, it involved time. Nagumo faced a terrible choice. When his first wave reported Midway wasn't destroyed, he could either launch the second strike on Midway immediately, keeping his planes armed for land attack, or reconfigure aircraft for anti-ship attack in case American carriers appeared. He tried to do both. And that is often fatal in war. Because trying to do both means you commit fully to neither. He began switching the loadout. Then, when a late scout report suggested American ships nearby, he reversed the order again. So the decks became a chaos of half-finished decisions. Bombs moved out. Torpedoes moved in. Then bombs moved back. Aircraft were fueled. Then fueled again. And all of it happened on open decks and hangar decks where fire spread like a living thing. This wasn't just a technical vulnerability. It was psychological. Nagumo was trying to control uncertainty. But uncertainty cannot be controlled. It can only be answered. And the Americans answered it with violence from above. Now, here's the deeper twist. Japan did not lose Midway because its pilots were inferior. Japan did not lose Midway because its ships were weak. Japan lost Midway because it underestimated one thing: how quickly information can collapse a perfect plan. Because once America knew what Japan intended, Japan's advantage became less important than America's positioning. And then the timing, the famous 5 minutes, was simply the moment the pressure finally snapped. It wasn't luck. It was a structural failure. A perfect plan, hit by a prepared opponent, at the worst possible time. And once it happened, the Japanese were not just losing ships. They were losing the core of their carrier doctrine. Because carriers are not only steel. Carriers are pilots. Training. Maintenance crews. Coordination. Experience. And Midway destroyed something Japan could not rebuild quickly. Its elite carrier air groups. And that's why the battle is called a turning point. Not because the war ended, but because Japan's ability to shape the war ended. To fully understand why Midway broke Japan's momentum, we have to look at something even more subtle than bombs and fire. We have to look at expectations. Because Japan didn't just misjudge American strength. Japan misjudged American behavior. Before Midway, Japanese naval doctrine was shaped by decades of experience, and by a very specific image of the enemy. In Japanese planning circles, the United States Navy was seen as cautious, methodical, predictable. The assumption was simple. America would defend first and attack second. Japan believed the Americans would keep their carriers close to Hawaii, that they would hesitate to risk them in open ocean, that they would react after Midway was hit. That belief shaped everything. It shaped the scouting plan. It shaped the timing. It shaped the confidence. And this is where another small error becomes catastrophic. Japanese reconnaissance on the morning of June 4th was incomplete. A scout plane launched late. Another searched the wrong sector. One crucial report, about American carriers, arrived delayed and vague. When the message finally came in, it didn't say, carriers. It said, enemy ships. That ambiguity mattered, because it arrived at the worst possible time, right when Nagumo was in the middle of rearming. Had that report arrived earlier, or been more specific, Nagumo might have committed fully to an anti-ship strike. He might have launched immediately, and Midway might have become a very different story. But war does not reward almost. It rewards timing. And this delay, measured in minutes, locked Nagumo into indecision. Now add another layer to the confusion. The Yorktown illusion. When Hiryu's pilots struck Yorktown, they believed they had damaged, and then sunk, multiple American carriers. They didn't realize it was the same ship. Yorktown's damage control was so effective, so fast, that she appeared to disappear and reappear. Smoke cleared. Fires were contained. Power came back. From the air, it looked like a fresh carrier had replaced a destroyed one. So Japanese reports began stacking errors on top of errors. They believed America had more carriers than it actually did. They believed the American fleet was still largely intact. And that false belief pushed Hiryu into desperate counterattacks that, while brave, only exposed it further. This is another quiet twist of Midway. The battle didn't just destroy ships. It destroyed situational awareness. Japan was fighting blind. America, meanwhile, was fighting informed. Not perfectly informed. Not effortlessly. But informed enough to act decisively. And here's the most important transformation that happens at Midway. Before this battle, aircraft carriers were often treated as support weapons. Powerful, yes, but still tied to battleships. Midway changes that forever. At Midway, battleships fire almost no decisive shots. Cruisers and destroyers play defensive roles. The true center of gravity becomes clear. The sky. From this point forward, naval power is measured in flight decks, not gun barrels. And everyone in the world is watching. The British, the Germans, the Soviets. They see what carrier warfare can do. They see how quickly a fleet can be erased, not by direct engagement, but by air power striking from beyond visual range. Midway doesn't just change the Pacific War. It rewrites global military doctrine. But there's one last psychological shift that often gets overlooked. After Midway, Japan no longer controls the tempo. Before Midway, Japan chooses where to strike. After Midway, Japan reacts. Defends. Guesses. The initiative, the invisible advantage, moves to the American side. And that matters more than territory. Because wars are not won by maps. They are won by momentum. And momentum, once lost, is brutally hard to recover. Japan will continue to fight fiercely. There will be more battles. Guadalcanal. The Philippine Sea. Leyte Gulf. But something has changed at the core. Japan can no longer afford mistakes. America can. And in war, the side that can afford mistakes usually wins. This is the final twist of Midway. The battle doesn't end Japan's ability to fight. It ends Japan's ability to dictate the fight. And once that power is gone, every future decision becomes heavier. Every loss hurts more. Every gamble risks collapse. Midway is not remembered because it was the largest battle. It's remembered because it shifted the invisible balance. The balance of confidence. The balance of initiative. The balance of belief in victory. And from this moment on, the Pacific War is no longer about how far Japan can expand. It's about how long Japan can hold on. By the evening of June 4, 1942, the battle is no longer about tactics. It's about survival. The Pacific Ocean, so calm that morning, is now littered with smoke, fire, and debris drifting slowly across the water. Japanese commanders face a reality they never planned for. 3 carriers are burning beyond recovery. The 4th, Kiryu, will soon follow. The strike force that opened the Pacific War at Pearl Harbor, the elite heart of Japan's naval air power, is being erased. And the shock is profound. This isn't just a loss of ships. It's the loss of certainty. On the Japanese side, confusion turns into disbelief. Orders are sent, then cancelled, then rewritten. Some ships try to regroup. Others search desperately for survivors in the water. Pilots who manage to land on surviving ships look back toward the horizon, watching columns of smoke where carriers used to be. For many of them, it feels unreal. Just hours ago, they believed victory was inevitable. Now, the ocean has swallowed the symbols of their dominance. On the American side, the mood is just as complex, but different. There is relief, but there is no celebration. Because the Americans know something deeply sobering. They came within inches of catastrophe. If the timing had shifted, just slightly, if the dive bombers had arrived minutes later, if the scout reports had been clearer, if Yorktown had sunk sooner, Midway could have been a disaster. And that realization weighs heavily. On Yorktown, the situation becomes grim. The carrier, damaged, listing, and powerless, is eventually abandoned. Sailors climb down nets into the water. Some look back at the ship with quiet respect. Yorktown doesn't explode. She doesn't burn dramatically. She lingers, wounded but defiant, before later being finished by a Japanese submarine. Her loss becomes part of the cost. Because even victories demand payment. As night falls, both fleets withdraw. The Japanese retreat westward. The Americans hold position, exhausted, damaged, but alive. And in that quiet withdrawal, the true scale of what has happened begins to sink in. Japan has lost 4 fleet carriers in a single battle. More importantly, Japan has lost hundreds of highly trained pilots and crew, men who took years to prepare. America has lost 1 carrier. Painful, but replaceable. This is the moment where numbers start to matter in a different way. Because steel can be rebuilt, but experience cannot. And the Pacific War is about to become a war of production. A war of training. A war of endurance. In Tokyo, the news is carefully controlled. The full scale of the defeat is not immediately revealed. But inside the Navy, the truth is understood. The offensive phase of the war is over. From now on, Japan will fight defensively, reactively, always trying to recover what was lost in a single day. In Washington, the tone is cautious. Midway is not announced as a decisive victory right away. But behind closed doors, leaders understand. The balance has shifted. America has seized the initiative. And initiative, once taken, is rarely surrendered. This is the climax of Midway. Not the explosions. Not the dogfights. But the realization, on both sides, that the war has crossed a line. There is no return to the world of December 1941. The Pacific War has entered a new phase. One defined not by shock attacks, but by relentless pressure. And as both sides look ahead into the darkness, they understand something quietly terrifying. The war is going to be longer, harder, and far more destructive than anyone imagined. Midway was only the beginning of that new reality. After Midway, the Pacific War doesn't pause. It pivots. Because battles aren't just about what gets destroyed. They're about what becomes possible afterward. And Midway makes something possible that seemed unthinkable just months earlier. America can go on the offensive. But first, both sides have to absorb what just happened. For Japan, Midway is a wound that doesn't close. On paper, losing 4 carriers is devastating. But the deeper loss is hidden. The pilots. Japan's carrier pilots were not easily replaced. They were the product of long, elite training programs built for quality, not quantity. Those pilots carried experience from China, from Pearl Harbor, from the early Pacific strikes. And many of them died with their carriers. That changes Japan's future overnight. Because you can build a new ship, but you can't instantly build a veteran. So Japan begins fighting with a shrinking pool of trained airmen. They still have courage. They still have discipline. But they no longer have the same edge. For America, Midway creates something equally powerful. Belief. Pearl Harbor had shocked the country. The early months of 1942 had been filled with retreat, loss, and uncertainty. Midway becomes proof that Japan can be beaten. Not in theory. In reality. That psychological shift, especially in wartime, can feel like a weapon in itself. Now add the industrial dimension. Japan enters the war expecting a short, decisive conflict. America enters the war as an industrial giant. And after Midway, that industrial weight begins to tilt the war like gravity. America starts building. Not just ships, but systems. New carriers. New aircraft. New pilots. New radar networks. New production pipelines. And every month the American fleet grows. Midway is the battle where Japan begins to run out of time. Because now Japan's losses are not just painful. They're permanent. Now the strategic map changes. Before Midway, Japan is taking territory. After Midway, Japan begins defending the territory it already took. And the next phase begins, an exhausting chain of island battles where both sides bleed for airstrips and harbors. Guadalcanal becomes the next proving ground. The Americans don't immediately rush into reckless attacks. They move carefully, but they move forward. Midway gives them the ability to choose when to strike. And that is initiative. You can feel it in Japanese planning afterward. They become cautious where they once were bold. They become reactive where they once were aggressive. They begin to prioritize protecting carrier forces instead of risking them. And that defensive mindset spreads. This is the resolution phase of Midway. The battle didn't end the war. But it ended Japan's ability to dictate it. It created a new rhythm. America builds, advances, pressures. Japan fights hard, retreats, regroups, tries to survive. And there's another impact, one that defines modern warfare forever. Midway proves that the carrier is the capital ship. Not the battleship. Not the cruiser. The carrier. The ship that controls the sky. Because at Midway, the decisive blows aren't delivered by ship guns across the horizon. They're delivered by aircraft. From beyond visibility. From angles the enemy can't respond to quickly enough. Midway teaches every navy in the world a brutal lesson. If you control the air, you control the sea. And if you lose your carriers, you can lose an entire war without ever seeing your enemy's fleet up close. That's why Midway becomes a textbook moment in military history. It's not just a battle. It's a transformation. And by 1943 and 1944, the Pacific War becomes what Midway predicted. A war of carriers, aircraft, and relentless momentum. So when historians say Midway was the turning point, they don't mean it was the moment the war became easy. They mean it was the moment the war became winnable. Because after Midway, Japan is no longer building a future. Japan is trying to stop America from taking it. Midway may have happened in 1942, but its lesson lives in every modern war room today. Because Midway wasn't just about bombs and carriers. It was about something that has become even more powerful in the 21st century. Information. At Midway, the Americans didn't win because they had more ships. They won because they had enough insight to place their ships in the right place and force Japan into a timing crisis. That idea, the power of knowing, has only grown. Today, militaries don't depend on codebreakers sitting in dark rooms with paper. They depend on satellites, signals intelligence, cyber operations, real-time surveillance. But the logic is the same. If you can see what the enemy plans, you can break their strategy before they even execute it. That's why Midway is often studied alongside modern conflicts where the first advantage is not firepower. It's awareness. Another Midway lesson is the concept of the decision window. At Midway, Japan became vulnerable during rearming. That vulnerability lasted minutes. A short window where the decks were crowded with fuel and munitions. A short window where fighter cover was pulled low. A short window where a perfect plan became fragile. And the Americans hit that window. Modern warfare is full of those windows. A carrier during resupply. A missile system during repositioning. A command network during data transfer. A convoy during refueling. These moments are when high-tech systems become exposed. And the side that recognizes those moments fastest wins. Midway also reshaped how the world thinks about the sea. Before carrier warfare, naval battles were often about line-of-sight power. Ships seeing each other. Guns firing across water. Midway proved that the decisive battle could happen without fleets ever meeting directly. That's the blueprint for modern naval doctrine. Control the air. Control the sea. And today, the air includes drones, long-range missiles, and electronic warfare. Another modern parallel is the psychological dimension. Japan walked into Midway believing it controlled the tempo. That belief shaped every decision. And when the belief collapsed, the plan collapsed with it. Modern military planners understand that morale and confidence aren't emotional side effects. They're operational variables. A force that believes it's winning will take risks. A force that realizes it's losing will become cautious, and caution changes outcomes. Finally, Midway offers a warning for modern powers. You can have the most advanced weapon system, but if your enemy knows how you plan to use it, that system becomes predictable. And predictability in war is danger. Because war is not just strength against strength. War is perception against perception. Information against deception. Timing against arrogance. That's why Midway matters even now. It's proof that huge powers can lose quickly, not because they are weak, but because they believed their plan was untouchable. Because the most dangerous moment in conflict is the moment you think you've already won. And that's the story of Midway, a battle that didn't just sink ships. It changed the direction of the entire world. Because after Midway, Japan stopped expanding, and America started advancing. And if you ever wonder how quickly history can turn, remember this. It didn't turn in a year. It turned in minutes. Now, if you enjoyed this kind of immersive history storytelling, where we don't just list events, we put you inside them, make sure you subscribe, because the next episodes are going even deeper. We're going to follow the Pacific War forward into the battles that came next, where victory wasn't decided in 5 minutes, but in months of exhaustion, fear, and endurance. And one of the next stories is the moment America and Japan collide again in a battle so massive, so violent, that pilots called it the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. A battle where the sky itself becomes a slaughterhouse of machines. And the outcome decides whether Japan still has a future in the air. So if you want that episode, subscribe now. And keep the bell on, because it's coming. And if you made it this far, comment the word Midway below. I read the comments. And it tells me you want more stories like this, stories where history doesn't feel distant. It feels alive.